a 25% tariff on all cars that are not made in the United States.
The president will be implementing tomorrow a 25% tariff.
America's most patriotic car brand just betrayed everything it stood for, and no one saw it coming. Stellantis, the automaker behind Jeep, didn't just pause production. It wiped out $63.5 billion in output overnight, shutting down factories in Detroit, Windsor, and Toluca like flipping a switch. This wasn't a slowdown. It was a full-body collapse. Plants froze, thousands were laid off. And the policies meant to protect American jobs? They triggered the fall. Tariffs, trade wars, and global supply chain chaos collided, and Jeep became the first victim. So how did the most American brand implode in silence? Why were loyal workers the first ones sacrificed? And what does this mean for the future of U.S. manufacturing? By the end, we'll show how a legendary brand became a cautionary tale, and why what happens next will either restore America's industrial soul or bury it. Families built on Jeep dreams. Watch their world crumble. Retirement savings, healthcare benefits, generational pride, all turned into bargaining chips overnight. At the Warren Truck Assembly Plant in Michigan, 1,100 families woke up to betrayal. The trucks they built, the Ram models and Wagoneers that defined American resilience, would not save them now. Corporate survival had replaced corporate loyalty. Since 1938, the Warren plant had produced more than 16 million vehicles. For decades, this plan embodied the promise of stable American employment. Workers passed down their positions like family heirlooms. That legacy ended with a layoff notice. Third-generation auto workers were left with nothing but memories. Grandfathers who had welded frames during World War II. Fathers who worked double shifts during recessions. Sons and daughters who now faced pink slips because policy decisions in Washington disrupted a system built over 80 years. It was not just the jobs, it was the social fabric. Workers with decades of experience faced displacement to plants hundreds of miles away. Newer hires faced termination outright. Even those offered transfers were often uprooted from lifelong communities. The result was upheaval masked as restructuring. Beneath the statistics lay real stories. Families forced to downsize, children pulled from college, mortgage payments missed, all caused not by foreign competitors, but by domestic policy choices that backfired catastrophically. The promise of American manufacturing was never about just numbers. It was about stability, identity, and trust. And for thousands of Jeep employees and their families, that trust had been erased in a single announcement. A trade war without borders, but with casualties. It was supposed to be a bold stance, protecting American industries through aggressive tariffs. Yet the effects hit hardest not in China or Europe, but in Michigan and Ontario. Jeeps were assembled in America, yes, but their lifeblood flowed through parts stamped in Mexico and Canada. Once tariffs choked that flow, the entire machine seized. This was not an abstract economic model. It was physical. Real engines delayed, real workers furloughed, real supply chains broken. Components that used to cross borders 3 or 4 times during production now faced duties at each crossing. The system, once celebrated for its efficiency, buckled under pressure it was never designed to endure. The Stellantis plants in Canada and Mexico weren't afterthoughts. They were critical. The Canadian facility assembled the Chrysler Pacifica and Dodge Charger Daytona. The Mexico plant was building the Jeep Compass and Wagoneer S. These were not fringe models. They were pillars of the company's future strategy, especially in the electric vehicle market. The idea that protectionism would bring jobs home collapsed under its own weight. Instead of revitalizing local employment, the tariffs rendered multi-billion-dollar production lines inert. American suppliers faced dwindling orders. Smaller firms downstream began laying off their own workers. Union leaders saw it coming. They warned that these measures would hurt American workers first. The reality was even harsher. Factories slowed before tariffs took effect, as companies scrambled to recalibrate. In the end, the casualties were not overseas rivals. They were the very workers the policies claimed to defend. We dug through corporate filings, union records, and global supply data to connect the dots no one else would. Now you've got the real story, not the press release version, on how Jeep's collapse blindsided the people who built it. If that saved you hours or opened your eyes, give something back. Subscribe, like, or drop a comment. The new normal no one voted for. The fallout was not just economic, it was existential. People who spent their lives on factory floors found themselves asking bigger questions. Was loyalty worth it? Could hard work really secure a future? The answers were not comforting. At Stellantis headquarters, officials spoke of rebalancing supply and demand. They used terms like market competitiveness and structural adjustments. For the workers on the ground, these phrases translated to eviction notices, job fairs, and empty dinner tables. When corporations lose confidence in the rules, they stop playing the game altogether. That is what happened here. Local economies braced for impact. Coffee shops near plants lost half their foot traffic. Tool suppliers saw orders dry up. Real estate listings spiked as displaced families scrambled to sell. Even schools reported drops in attendance as parents relocated or could no longer afford private education. The shutdowns rippled outward, cutting across every facet of community life. For decades, political leaders had promised that reshoring would bring prosperity back. Yet every factory shuttered told a different story. The more the system tried to isolate itself, the more interconnected consequences revealed themselves. America did not just lose production, it lost belief. This was not a foreign takeover or a market correction. It was self-inflicted. A blueprint for revival had turned into a cautionary tale. And for those still clocking into the surviving shifts at Stellantis plants, the new normal was defined not by routine, but by uncertainty. Generational betrayal, when decades of loyalty mean nothing. The collapse did not just erase jobs, it erased heritage. In Kokomo, Indiana, the Morrison family had worked on Jeep powertrains for 3 generations. Grandfather William began in 1952, Father Robert in 1978, and son Michael in 2005. Each believed that loyalty to American industry meant stability. They were all wrong. Across the Midwest, similar stories echoed through factory towns. Families with histories at Ford and Stellantis discovered that everything they had built could vanish with a single corporate decision. In Detroit, the Kowalskis. In Toledo, the Rodriguezes. In Warren, the Johnsons. Each had given lifetimes to these plants. Now that history had been reduced to a severance check. These were not just careers, they were blueprints for life. High schools shaped curriculums around manufacturing jobs. Young couples planned weddings based on steady dual incomes from auto plants. Retirement dreams were formed with the confidence of pensions and benefits earned over decades of work. When the plants went silent, the sense of betrayal was overwhelming. Maria Santos, whose family worked at the Toledo Jeep plant, put it simply, "They didn't just close a factory, they closed our story." Entire communities felt the shock. In Hamtramck, Michigan, auto wages supported everything, from churches to diners to Little League uniforms. Once the jobs vanished, every institution built on their backs began to crumble. Local leaders found themselves asking impossible questions. Stay and fight, or leave and lose everything familiar? The collapse wasn't just economic, it was generational, and its wounds were carved deep into the soul of American manufacturing towns. When the corner diner closes, so does the town. Factories are more than machines. They are ecosystems. When Stellantis shuttered plants, the economic fallout spread like wildfire. First went the direct jobs. Then came the closures of small businesses that depended on workers' patronage. It happened in weeks. The local diner that had opened at 4 o'clock every morning for early shifts locked its doors forever. The hardware store where plant workers bought tools emptied its shelves. The parts supplier, long operated by a retired line manager, sold its final inventory. In these towns, businesses were not merely vendors. They were extensions of the factory. A welding shop owner might also be the football coach. A barber might fix engines on weekends. When Jeep work dried up, so did their livelihoods. The psychological impact was equally devastating. Business owners who once believed in the stability of automotive towns felt abandoned. Their plans, savings, and even their community roles had been built around the factory's pulse. Without it, they were directionless. Some tried to pivot. A former parts distributor in Toledo began importing aftermarket accessories. A machinist in Warren took up custom fabrication. But the customer base had disappeared. Residents who stayed cut spending to the bone. Those who left took disposable income with them. The ecosystem could not survive the shock. As more businesses shuttered, the towns hollowed out. Streets grew quieter. Homes sat vacant. Churches, once full of proud workers in Sunday best, saw dwindling attendance. The question no one wanted to ask was becoming unavoidable. If Jeep leaves, what is left of us? Childhoods rewritten by a vanishing industry. The devastation reached even those far too young to understand supply chains or trade policy. In classrooms across the Midwest, the future was quietly rewritten. Children who had grown up drawing trucks in crayon and wearing miniature hard hats on school trips to the plant suddenly watched their parents break down over dinner. The stories they had once proudly shared. My mom designs Jeep dashboards. My dad supervises the line, faded into silence. Emma, 8 years old, dreamed of becoming an engineer like her mother. That dream was now uncertain. Marcus, age 12, had idolized his father's role on the floor. With no plant to return to, his hero felt powerless. Sarah, 16, had earned early admission to an engineering program, planning to come home to work at Stellantis. Her plan no longer had a place. It wasn't just about employment, it was about identity. These communities raised their children on the promise of industrial purpose. Career days were hosted at plants. Factory tours were rites of passage. Teens worked summer internships on the floor. The plants were more than workplaces. They were schools, mentors, and aspirations all in one. Now, guidance counselors scrambled for alternatives. Teachers restructured career lessons. Parents, unsure of what came next, stopped encouraging technical careers at all. The shared dream passed down for generations had ended, not with a crash, but with the quiet closure of a factory gate. Entire childhoods were altered, not by failure, but by disconnection. The paths that had once seemed inevitable now no longer existed. Hope dims, but the fight continues. The families that built these factories did not surrender easily. Some adapted with grit. The Martinez family opened a repair shop using decades of mechanical knowledge to serve local drivers. The Chens invested their severance into retraining, targeting opportunities in renewable energy. The Williams family left Michigan altogether, chasing manufacturing jobs in Tennessee. Yet even adaptation had its limits. What was lost was more than income, it was purpose. The transmission specialist who now repaired lawnmowers, the project manager who processed insurance claims, the union rep who moved boxes in a warehouse. They had found work, but not fulfillment. Others remained in place, unwilling to abandon their towns. They organized job fairs, petitioned local governments, and applied for grant programs. Yet, despite their best efforts, few new industries had the cultural fit or economic scale to replace what Jeep had once meant. Local leaders searched for solutions. Some tried to attract electric vehicle startups. Others pushed for tech campuses or logistics hubs. But many of these required skill sets not widely held in the community. Retraining programs filled up quickly, but too often led to short-term gigs or out-of-state contracts. For those unwilling or unable to move, the future remained uncertain. Even hope became a contested idea. Was it naive to believe the plants could return, or noble to keep faith alive? What remained was resolve. Not blind optimism, but quiet determination. A belief that even if factories never reopened, the spirit that built them could still shape what came next. Trump's tariff gamble, policy intention versus reality. It happened in a single stroke. The 25% tariff imposed by President Donald Trump, marketed as a bold strike for American labor, instead ignited one of the swiftest industrial contractions in United States automotive history. Intended to bring jobs home, the policy unraveled a system that had taken decades to build. In the name of protectionism, it delivered a body blow to the very workforce it promised to defend. At its heart, the failure lay in a misunderstanding of modern industry. Manufacturing in the 21st century is not a national endeavor. It is a network. American vehicles, including Jeeps, depend on components crafted in Mexico, electronics from Canada, and materials shipped across 3 borders before final assembly. Tariffs on imports crippled this flow. Factories that needed uninterrupted supply chains ground to a halt. The contradiction was painful. An administration that claimed to champion workers implemented policies that dismantled their livelihoods. The pain was not strategic, it was collateral. Jobs were lost, not to foreign competition, but to American legislation. Entire towns entered economic freefall, not because the market shifted, but because the law did. Industry experts had warned this would happen. In closed-door meetings, economists showed models predicting supply chain disruption. Executives detailed risks. Labor leaders begged for nuance. The warnings were dismissed. Loyalty to a political narrative outweighed loyalty to the people the policy was supposed to protect. The damage was not theoretical. It had names, addresses, and mortgage payments. And it was only just beginning. We cross-referenced government records, plant closures, and consumer sentiment reports to show the fallout in full. You're not just hearing headlines, you're seeing the entire collapse play out layer by layer. If that gave you clarity, give this video some fuel. Subscribe or leave a comment. The collapse no one wanted to own. Within Washington, the silence was louder than any speech. As plant closures rippled across the Midwest, the White House remained mute. Reporters requested comment. Union leaders demanded answers. Economists published post-mortems while factories went dark. The administration had staked its credibility on manufacturing revival, and now faced the stark reality of decline without a prepared response. The refusal to acknowledge the fallout came not from ignorance, but from a political strategy rooted in denial. Officials were instructed to stay on message. Trade war was strength. Economic pain was transition. Criticism was disloyalty. Reality, it seemed, had no place in the plan. Meanwhile, foreign competitors moved fast. Chinese manufacturers, who had long struggled to crack the American market, found their opening as supply chains fractured. European automakers offered stability to dealerships desperate for inventory. Even Canadian and Mexican producers, once partners in integrated North American trade, began exploring ways to pivot toward more predictable partners overseas. On Capitol Hill, the backlash brewed quietly. Republican lawmakers from manufacturing districts grew anxious. Senators who had clapped during tariff announcements now fielded calls from laid-off workers. Their base, once energized by talk of restoring industry, was now facing the loss of everything that made their communities viable. Trade had become a political battlefield, but its casualties were not ideas. They were workers. The tariffs, rather than isolating foreign competition, had isolated American manufacturers from their own supply lifelines. It was not globalization that had destroyed production. It was the attempt to defy it without understanding its mechanics. When policy becomes punishment. Outside Washington's corridors, the policy misstep translated into immediate suffering. In the Midwest, mayors convened emergency town halls. Unemployment offices extended hours. Food banks faced triple the usual demand. Every closed factory sent out shockwaves, economic, emotional, and cultural. Politicians called it restructuring. Workers called it betrayal. In Michigan, Mayor Mike Duggan described the chaos. "We were told this would bring our jobs back. Instead, we're burying them." For local officials, managing the fallout meant navigating contradictions. Republican governors tried to defend a federal policy while explaining its devastating results. Democratic governors, whose warnings had gone unheeded, were left to clean up a mess they had tried to prevent. Federal aid was slow. Clarity was rare. Blame was passed like a hot coal. State-level leaders faced practical crises. How do you retrain thousands of workers whose skill sets were tailored for a system that no longer exists? What happens to public schools when property tax revenue collapses? Can towns survive a second industrial decline within a generation? Answers were elusive. What remained was grief. Communities felt not only abandoned, but punished for voting, for believing, for trusting. Political promises had been made in the language of pride and restoration. The outcomes arrived in pink slips and foreclosure notices. Those who had hoped for renaissance now faced a reckoning, and many began to wonder, was this the cost of pride or the price of being misled? Global fallout, local consequences. The ripple effect was not limited to the United States. As the American automotive sector faltered, allies grew wary. In Canada, officials questioned the reliability of cross-border agreements. In Mexico, trust in trilateral economic cooperation eroded. Countries that had once partnered in production now looked for ways to insulate themselves from American unpredictability. Trade wars, by nature, create uncertainty. In the past, that uncertainty had been a tool. This time, it had become a hazard. The American economy was still massive, but its political volatility made long-term commitments dangerous. Foreign manufacturers adapted. Japan ramped up domestic production. South Korea shifted distribution strategies. Germany doubled down on internal European markets. Even American multinationals began expanding operations abroad, not for labor cost savings, but to avoid future policy whiplash. Meanwhile, military contractors raised alarms. Many relied on the same suppliers used in civilian automotive production. When those lines stopped, so did critical defense components. National security, it turned out, shared infrastructure with minivan production. The fallout was more than economic. It had strategic consequences. Back home, the lesson was undeniable. Trade policy could not be written with slogans. It required understanding, consultation, and coordination. None of that had happened. What had started as a nationalist economic push had ended in diminished global standing. Allies felt burned, rivals felt emboldened, and workers felt forgotten. The full story of the tariff collapse was still being written, but for many, the ending had already arrived. Brand destruction. From icons to pariahs overnight, Jeep had always been more than a vehicle. It was a symbol of freedom, resilience, American ingenuity. For 24 consecutive years, it was named the most patriotic brand in the United States. Then, almost overnight, that legacy collapsed. The very moment Jeep's plants went dark, its image followed, plunging from national pride to national disappointment. Patriotic commercials ran between news segments detailing thousands of layoffs. Social media campaigns about dependability were interrupted by footage of shuttered factories and community protests. The dissonance was impossible to ignore. Consumers who had trusted the brand as a beacon of American grit now saw it as a mask for betrayal. It wasn't a slow erosion, it was an implosion. Jeep's heritage, born on the battlefields of World War II, refined in factories that paid American wages, had been weaponized against itself. Trade policy and corporate strategy, once considered safeguards, became tools of self-destruction. Even Jeep's celebrated advertising achievements turned hollow. Harrison Ford's award-winning commercial reached millions, but failed to soothe workers walking away from empty plants. The marketing machine was still spinning, but the factories had stopped. Brand researchers observed something rare: emotional severance. Jeep wasn't just losing customers, it was losing believers. Trust, once absolute, was replaced with anger. Words like authentic and loyal gave way to hypocritical and exploitative. Jeep had promised to take Americans anywhere. Now it couldn't even promise to take them to work. As plants closed, the brand's foundation cracked, not from a loss of horsepower, but from a collapse in meaning. Loyalty reversed when customers walk away. Jeep's brand collapse didn't stay confined to factory gates. It followed customers into living rooms, dealerships, and online communities. Buyers who once proudly identified with the brand now looked for ways to detach. What had been a badge of honor became a source of embarrassment. Supporting Jeep no longer felt patriotic. It felt complicit. Focus groups documented the turn in real time. Drivers who had purchased multiple Jeeps over decades suddenly described the brand as manipulative and tone-deaf. Some kept their vehicles but removed brand decals. Others sold their Jeeps altogether, refusing to drive a machine that now symbolized broken promises. The fallout spread beyond customers. Dealerships, once proud to host Jeep banners, began experiencing backlash. Community members confronted sales staff. Franchise owners received angry letters blaming them for supporting a company that had gutted local economies. Some dealers quietly explored switching to other brands, fearing long-term damage to their own reputations. Ford and Toyota saw sales increase, not through major new marketing efforts, but through brand migration. As Jeep faltered, competitors appeared stable by comparison. Ford's "Built Ford Tough" felt consistent. Toyota's reputation for reliability stood in contrast to Jeep's visible collapse. Consumers were not just buying a product, they were making a statement. Within Stellantis, internal employee networks imploded. Workers lost faith in leadership. Pride in producing a beloved brand gave way to bitterness. Even the most dedicated line veterans began to question why they had given so much to a company that gave so little in return. Loyalty reversed, and once it turned, it did not come back. From heritage to liability. When icons implode, Jeep's collapse marked more than a brand failure. It signaled a cultural crisis. The name once etched into American steel now appeared in headlines alongside words like betrayal, collapse, and layoffs. Jeep, Ford, Chevrolet, these were not just companies. They were part of America's story. Now one of them had torn out a chapter. For years, Jeep thrived not because of horsepower or pricing, but because it stood for something: grit, independence, rugged self-reliance. That identity had been cultivated carefully through war, recession, and recovery. But no amount of legacy could protect it from the perception that it had betrayed its own workers. Dealerships once treated the Jeep name like gold. Now it was radioactive. Communities that once celebrated new Jeep model launches with parades now met announcements with protests. Auto shows that featured Jeep test tracks were forced to reckon with empty booths and customer complaints. Even Jeep clubs, once vibrant social networks of enthusiasts, turned somber. Online forums became echo chambers for disillusionment. Facebook groups shifted from planning trail rides to organizing boycotts. Brand ambassadors stopped posting. Hashtag campaigns died in silence. The international impact was just as profound. In Europe and Asia, Made in America once carried cultural prestige. Now it triggered associations with instability, exploitation, and short-term thinking. Overseas consumers watched the Jeep brand unravel in its homeland and questioned whether it had anything left to offer globally. Jeep's reputation had been earned through decades of resilience. It was lost in weeks through mismanagement and political fallout. What was once heritage became liability. The long goodbye: can icons be rebuilt? By the time the dust settled, the question was no longer whether Jeep would recover. It was whether it should even try. The brand that once symbolized American strength now served as a warning. Even icons are not immune to miscalculation. For every laid-off worker, there was a disillusioned driver. For every closed plant, there was a shuttered small business. The wounds were not only deep, they were visible, and they were not healing. Some within Stellantis began discussing rebranding strategies, whispered talks of electric-only lineups, new slogans, new narratives. But insiders knew the truth. No marketing campaign could revive trust once it had been breached at this scale. What was needed was not a new logo, but a new contract with the people who made the brand matter in the first place. That meant transparency, not spin, real investment, not ribbon cuttings, a recognition that reputations are not inherited. They are earned every day on the floor and on the road. It also raised tougher questions, ones Jeep can no longer afford to ignore. Can a brand apologize without action? Will leadership step up or stay silent behind polished press releases? What does real accountability look like when entire communities feel abandoned? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear from you. Thanks.